G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and this one is quite exciting because we are looking at the Vigilance Committee. And it's important to understand why it was formed, who was involved, and also we're going to look at two particular people, George Lusk and Albert Beckett, who's a very interesting individual himself. But why was the Vigilance Committee formed? But firstly, what was the situation in Whitechapel in general? Because this is important to know why the Vigilance Committee was set up. Well, census records showed that Whitechapel was just packed with people. Its population density was huge. In fact, it was 4 times higher than the Greater London area itself, which also was densely populated. It meant that Whitechapel had more doss houses, it had more workhouses, it had people renting rooms to families. People were jammed in like sardines, so poverty was absolutely rampant. And also, sanitation wasn't exactly great. There was not a real good sewerage system, and it's said that getting clean drinking water was a risky business. It wasn't exactly just on tap. So if you couldn't trust what was coming out of the tap, what would you do as an alternative? Yeah, you'd probably go to the pub and get something you knew was at least sterile, because the alcohol killed the germs. And so alcoholism was rife as well. So the lack of sanitation, the prolificness of these pubs and people probably wanting to drink something they knew was safe, many people were succumbing to an early demise because of these conditions. So we need to look at the police force. And what is of note here is that a lot of the police were from the country. They were these young, strapping lads from the bush, as we would say in Australia. Because even though things were difficult on the land in the rural areas at the time and people were trying to move to the cities, it seemed that these young lads from the country must have got better nourishment because they were a little bit bigger than the city folk. And the police force chose people not because of intelligence. Now, that's what is officially stated. They weren't looking for book smart people, would be a better way of saying it. They were looking for people of character. So if you were the right temperament, upstanding, well, you'd get the job. But then you've got a police force on the beat, not the ones in the offices or the inspectors, but the ones on the street who were unfamiliar with city life growing up, not necessarily seen by people as being super intelligent. But 2 days after the Annie Chapman murder, a group of about 12 to 16 blokes met in the Crown Tavern in Whitechapel. They said enough's enough after these 2 murders. We have to do something about it. Yes, because despite of all the poverty and stuff that I mentioned before that was around Whitechapel, there were some quite wealthy people as well. So some businesses had been set up. And they now saw this situation as dire, because they were trying to change the reputation of Whitechapel. They didn't want it to be known as this area that people who had no money and all these terrible things were happening, because they've invested in the area. And their investment was at risk because the papers now had all this stuff going on about this monster in Whitechapel. And they were putting in the graphic detail of these crimes. And they said the police aren't doing anything about it, so we will. And here is a detail that I found absolutely fascinating. It was not the first Vigilance Committee set up in this area. No, there was one set up after the Martha Tabram murder. So the people around George's yard set up a Vigilance Committee. It did not last long. But this Vigilance Committee weren't even talking about that crime. They were only focused on Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. Because the Vigilance Committee said, we want the lives of these two people to be just as important as some royalty that had been murdered or some high society people. I find that interesting because they did not include Martha Tabram or the other previous people who had died in the area in terrible ways not that long before these events. Now, why? Well, I think it does show, despite what many people might think of the Vigilance Committee, they were doing this solely for self-interest and their business reasons, and it was the papers that drove this. If the papers hadn't run such a story, I don't think these blokes would have got together at the Crown Tavern on that night of September the 10th. Now, I'm not saying that they were just doing this totally self-serving. No, they were doing a noble thing. I'm just saying they may not have gone as far as they did if it wasn't for the publicity that the papers had thrown on these crimes and cast a dark cloud over Whitechapel. Now, there is a list of people that met in the Crown Tavern, many trades, an actor, and other people, and they nominate George Lusk as the president of the Vigilance Committee. Now, George Lusk was a builder and decorator, and I'd suggest that he was running a decent business because these blokes did have skin in this game, not only from what they could lose, but they employed a couple of private detectives and also hired people to patrol the streets. They said, we will make this place safe again. And I think it's safe to say that the Vigilance Committee probably did actually make a difference, because it was September the 8th that Annie Chapman lost her life. We're not talking until September the 30th did the next official crime happen. But who was George Lusk? Well, most of what is known about him is because of this chairman, or I should say president of the Vigilance Committee. Yet he was born in 1839. He was married, had 7 children, and from what I've seen, the last of his children passed away in 1967. He himself passed away in 1919. He was a Freemason, and I know that freaks people out, but it's not as scary as it's made out to be, because in 1889 he was sort of kicked out because he didn't pay his membership fees. Maybe because he was running out of cash because of paying all these people trying to catch Jack the Ripper. No, I don't think so. He may have just had other interests going on at the time, particularly this Vigilance Committee. Because I actually think being president of this committee was a bit of a poisoned chalice. Because his face was on posters. He was now in the national press. People were talking to him. He became very well known and is still well known today, though many people couldn't even mention at least 4 other blokes who were part of this committee. But the press loved George Lusk because they could get information. They could interview this person, and the press were giving it to the police. And George Lusk did a little bit. But he was also working with the police in a way. And they would give him information, including when they told him to disband this committee. He's like, no, because that criminal's still out there. They are said to have given him information to suggest that, no, it's over. The bloke is either dead or locked up. Now, it's important to note that George Lusk did receive a couple of letters from supposedly Jack the Ripper, or at least so it's said, because some people now have made the assertion that the Dear Boss letter wasn't even written back then. It was put into the records at a later time. But he did receive a letter with part of a human kidney in it, and that got a lot of attention at the time, though he didn't actually think much of it, but it was the Vigilance Committee that basically made him take it to a doctor. But during 1889, the whole Jack the Ripper saga was going away because the publicity from the papers after the Mary Kelly murder meant that it was starting to drop off a cliff. So the Vigilance Committee just slowly petered out until a new chairman took over, Albert Beckett. Now, this bloke was born in 1863. He's listed as an engraver, lived in Whitechapel. He was a much younger man than most of those on the committee, and I cannot find any record that he was at that initial meeting when the committee was formed. But he takes a very prominent role in 1889 moving forwards. Now, I won't go through all the details because there is quite a lot. But it was important to note that starting in 1885, which meant he was only 22 years old, he'd already started doing a bit of self-promotion to run for a political office. He complained a bit of police harassment. He was at the Bloody Sunday Trafalgar Square protest. Also, he says, being pushed around by the police. But then in 1889, he starts receiving communications from Jack the Ripper. Firstly, he gets a message written on his wall that a policeman saw, and it basically said, "I'm back." Well, no one saw that. Actually, it said, "Dear boss." So now, rather than George Lusk being the boss, Albert Beckett now was. But that was just graffiti, so that was wiped off, so no one actually saw that. But then he gets letters from Jack the Ripper addressing him as "Dear Boss," and telling him he was going to commit crimes. Now, on one particular night when the Ripper said he was going to perform the crime, it doesn't happen. And he tells the papers that's because the Vigilance Committee, Jack the Ripper, is worried that we're going to catch him. Now, what really helped him was that he saw a woman being attacked by a bloke with a knife in 1889, and he intervened. He struggled and fought with the bloke, and people came over and helped detain the guy until the police took him away. And they thought maybe they'd caught Jack the Ripper, but no, that wasn't to be the case. But now the papers are like, yeah, this bloke's actually out there doing something. He's not just talking about it. He's intervening. He's like Superman. And this is before Superman even became a thing. Got this young, energetic bloke, happy to talk to the press, fighting crime. Well, things take a bit of a turn for the worse for Albert Beckett during 1889. He got involved in a bit of a coin fraud. Now, he said that's just absolute nonsense, though I have nothing to do with that, and the case did get dismissed. But interestingly, the papers start changing their tone towards Albert Beckett. They go from saying the chairman of the Vigilance Committee to the supposed chairman of the Vigilance Committee, or even the self-proclaimed chairman of the Vigilance Committee. Now, interestingly, no one from the original Vigilance Committee said much about this bloke, saying we don't know who he is. So he must have had some connections somehow, but I'd say they were just happy to go back to their business. Let this guy have at it. Now, many letters he was receiving, the things that he said he was doing was being brought into question by the press, so he backed away a fair bit. You don't hear much about him until 1891, when Francis Coles is murdered. He jumps back up into the spotlight. He now says, I've been invited to sit on the jury of the inquest. That, though, however, wasn't true. Despite that, he says, well, you know what, I'm going to turn up anyway because they need me. And there was a spot available on the jury, and he says, well, I'm going to take it. And the coroner says, really appreciate the offer, buddy. Thanks for that, but there's the door. We're not going to use you. An actual argument ensued between Beckett and the coroner, but no, he did not sit on the Francis Coles jury. But he used this jump back up into the spotlight to help further his political career, because he is now running for office, and apparently he's got support behind him. But then a strange event happens. It was mid-1891, and he gets arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Now, the press interviews somebody, and they say, well, that was a fairly common occurrence for this Albert Beckett bloke. He'd get on the drink a bit, act a bit stupid, mostly on a Tuesday. Don't know why, but that's what was reported. He gets convicted. Unlike a few other times he's gone to court, this time he gets a conviction against him which rules him out from running for political office. Because he couldn't run for political office, he decides that he is going to go overseas. Apparently did a whip around of the hat to get some money and then took off. And that's likely what happened because we don't hear of him again. We actually have no official record of what happened to him after this conviction. He just disappears. Some people have said that he was Jack the Ripper as well. I think that is also a longbow. I personally believe he was a great self-promoter. See, this is before the days of social media. You didn't have your TikTok, Snapchats, or YouTube to promote yourself, but you needed to use the papers, and he used them effectively, and it probably would have worked out for him, except for a couple of little things in his personal life got in the way of moving forward this political career that he basically was trying to start all the way back in 1885. But that is the story of the Vigilance Committee to do with the Jack the Ripper crimes. Yes, definitely the original committee was set up to protect the business interests. And it may have actually stopped some crimes because they did slow down whilst this committee was very, very active. So it is surprising then that on September the 30th, 2 crimes are committed. And in the next video, we are going to dive into that first one, Elizabeth Stride's crime scene. Let me know what you think about this one down in comments. Albert Beckett may have been a shameless self-promoter who really didn't do that much in fighting crime except for that one instance where he fought someone with a knife. But then, was that story ever verified? That is a very interesting question because the press ran with it, but there's no record that they have actually fact-checked anything. But did George Lusk and his original Vigilance Committee hold back crimes from being committed? I'd be interested to know what you think of that. So we will be diving into the crime scenes for the next few videos. I myself find it interesting just to deep dive into who was there, who was nearby, and just asking those questions that just come up when you look at that in just a bit more detail. So look out for those videos. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.